Well, dry January is behind us, but conversations about alcohol are far from over. Many are re-examining their own relationship to alcohol after the new guidelines came out, and some are taking stock of just how normalized drinking is. You know, like mum beers, grabbing a 2-4 before May long, an all-inclusive midwinter vacation that includes loads of alcohol. You know what I'm getting at. Drinking has been a pretty big part of our culture. Many still enjoy after-work happy hour, but things are also shifting. And one of the big reasons why is the health effects. So our guest for the hour is Dr. Peter Butt. He helps people with their alcohol use. We also have a doctor who's working on getting warnings on alcohol similar to cigarettes. And we'll also hear from the CBC host of the podcast On Drugs about his relationship with alcohol and societies. Now, we do hope to hear from drinkers and non-drinkers today. Why do you or don't you? Should there be warning labels? Give us a call at 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. Dr. Peter Butt had planned to be retired by now, but during the pandemic, the Saskatoon doctor found there were just too many people in this province who needed his help with alcohol use. Dr. Butt is a clinical associate professor in the College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. He co-chaired Canada's Guide on Alcohol and Health. He's also an addictions consultant with the Saskatchewan Health Authority and has worked on substance abuse for decades. He is with me in our Saskatoon studio. Dr. Butt, hello.
How do you do? Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. I want to start by asking you how much people are drinking these days. I think there's been a decrease. The most recent numbers we have from the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse and Addiction showed that people drank less in 2023 than in the years before that. What's going on there?
Yes, there has been a decrease. Part of this is driven by a demographic shift with regards to the younger generation, younger adults, are not drinking as heavily as they did in the past. So this is contributing in part to the decline, but I think the message is also getting through to people that less is better, which was the primary message that we had in our guidance.
Before we go a whole lot further, because there's a lot to get into today, I want to just ask you how we can have this conversation. Can we have this conversation without judgment? You know, and how you navigate that line, right? Because there are people listening who do still drink, and you're sharing evidence-based research that shows the health effects. So how can we have this conversation that doesn't sound super judgy?
Well, that's an excellent question. And actually, it was something that we struggled with initially with regards to the Canadian guidance, because when we went to focus groups, they told us that, look, we don't want to be told what to do. Thank you very much. Give us the information, tell us why it's important, and help us to actualize it in some way. So we shifted away from technical guidelines that were much more explicit with regards to what you should do and what you shouldn't do, to wanting to provoke a conversation. Our primary recommendation was that Canadians should consider reducing the amount that they drink. That's it. Very Canadian. You should consider drinking less. And across the board, when you think about the impact that alcohol has from a public health perspective, people that are drinking at a higher level, and in our higher risk category, that would be 7 drinks per week, 7 standard drinks per week, so just 1 a day and more would be considered higher risk based upon the health data.
That made people pause, right? Like that took people aback a bit.
Yes.
That's all it takes to be a heavy drinker.
Well, to be at increased risk of harm.
I see.
So we know from the health data, which is something that we felt should be put forward to consumers in a very straightforward way, so that they could make informed decisions and hopefully reduce the amount that they drink. And arguably, somebody going from 18 standard drinks a week down to 12, because it's a steeper curve when you're at a higher level, is going to have a better result in terms of their health than somebody going from 6 to 4 standard drinks a week.
Part of the reason why we're having this conversation with you today is that there's new information out that tells us what happened in the pandemic when it comes to alcohol. Can you just explain what it is we know now about how alcohol impacted people in the pandemic?
Well, during the pandemic, it was quite interesting because I shifted from a community-based practice to an inpatient, in-hospital addiction medicine consultation service. And what we noticed was a dramatic increase in the number of people being admitted for complications from their alcohol use, perhaps to manage their withdrawal or because of alcohol hepatitis or cirrhosis of the liver, a host of other related problems, both directly and indirectly caused by alcohol. And what we were seeing was that people were chemically coping. So people that didn't meet criteria for an alcohol use disorder pre-pandemic were becoming heavier drinkers, they were becoming daily drinkers, they were becoming heavy daily drinkers, and then they were drinking to avoid withdrawal. So they were coming in with clearly an alcohol use disorder, which is a spectrum disorder. There's mild, moderate, and severe. But they were coming in need of help for something that wouldn't have been an issue prior to the pandemic. And this was related to the social isolation.
Yeah. So what ended up being the impact of that? And there was actually something interesting that your colleague said that I'd like you to elaborate on, because this person was saying that it's still not clear what the long-term effects of increased alcohol consumption during the pandemic will be, like rates of some cancers that are caused by alcohol. So we still don't have an entirely clear picture yet.
No, we don't, because, of course, it has a cumulative effect on the liver, on different organs. There are 7 different types of cancer that are causally associated with alcohol. It's a group 1 carcinogen. We've known this since the late 1980s, and yet it's not something that has been well picked up and understood, I would say, in the health community as well as in the general population. And certainly at an industry level, you would think that a group 1 carcinogen that's intended to be ingested would have an alcohol warning label on it, but we don't have that.
Yeah, and we're going to get more into that in a bit, but just staying with the pandemic for a bit, because I'm having flashbacks, and I think, a lot of like the talk at that time, like, yes, people were using alcohol to cope, but it was almost framed in like a fun way, right? Like cocktails were starting earlier. We were all working from home. Could there have been anything done to prevent that? Like, that's part of the conversation now, reflecting on what happened, and could the outcomes have been different? Absolutely.
And I think that it's not hard to look back and realize that when you're in the midst of a public health emergency, what you shouldn't do is provide psychoactive drugs more readily. Alcohol was made more available in terms of off sales, home deliveries at any hours of the day. And there was actually, during that period of time, some pausing in the taxation of beverage alcohol, or certainly immediately thereafter. So we saw this opening up of access. And at the same time, we weren't offering people other ways of coping. We weren't providing them with online or by telephone increased mental health services. We needed to be able to provide people with more assistance with regards to how to cope with the isolation and the anxiety and the disruption in their life and the lack of normal social contact.
What would you say to people listening who might be like, well, that was 5 years ago now, and why are we still talking about the pandemic? Like, what is it that I'm actually curious what you hope to get out of the conversation today before we go to a few of our other guests. But why do you want this in the zeitgeist?
Well, I think it's important because just as consumption went up during the pandemic, yes, it's come down subsequently, but there are some people that are continuing to drink at heavy levels, at high levels. And the cumulative impact in terms of those cancers, in terms of the effect on the liver, the heart, and so on, is continuing on for some people. And there's help available. There's a number of different ways that we can very practically reduce the amount that one consumes. And if people actually have an alcohol use disorder and they've lost control, it's become compulsive, and they're continuing to use despite negative consequences, which is really the hallmark of a substance use disorder, that there's help available for them.
I'm speaking today with Dr. Peter Butt, who helps people with their alcohol use. And we do hope to hear from you today. Are you noticing a shift? What about your own habits? Just love to hear from people today, those that do drink, those that don't drink. Do you think we should be moving towards warning labels on beer and wine and whatnot? The number to call is 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. Jeff Turner is the host of the CBC podcast on drugs. And on season 3, he reflects on his own alcohol use and society's relationship with alcohol. And so I'd like to welcome Jeff Turner to the podcast. Hello.
Hi, Lisa. And hello, Dr. Butt.
How do you do?
Jeff, you fit right in with this conversation today. I thought of you immediately as I've been listening to the first couple episodes of your podcast. What made you curious about alcohol in the context of all this work you've done on drugs? Like, why does season 3 tackle alcohol?
I'd wanted to do it sooner, and I think maybe to some degree I avoided it because whether consciously or subconsciously, I knew that by tackling it as a subject for the show, I was going to be forced into a reckoning of my own issues with alcohol. And maybe the timing was just right for a lot of reasons for me to finally do that. And just full disclosure, I actually nearly completed the episode without actually taking on the personal stuff. And then it felt so false that I thought, okay, I need to address some things here. And I was starting work on it around the end of dry January last year and just decided to keep going with it. And that, along with a bunch of things, including the new guidance from Health Canada around the number of drinks that you can safely, I've got that in air quotes, drink. It just got me thinking and made me realize I need to take this on in a different way.
Okay, so what did you do? What kind of reckoning did you have with yourself?
Well, I guess the simplest way of putting it is that I haven't had a drink now in 1 year and 1 month, plus what are we, 4 days in? Yeah. So that was the biggest consequence, is that dry January turned into a permanent thing for me. I had always, if 2 drinks is the most you can drink without worrying about serious harm, I've been doing a lot more than that since I was probably 14 years old. And that escalated, I think, like a lot of people during the pandemic. I lost a dear cousin to suicide, he was suffering really severe alcoholism. So I looked a lot of these things in the eye and just made a decision for myself that finally at 55 years old, the time had come and I wasn't going to drink anymore.
What did your drinking look like before you gave it up? Like what did it look like in your life?
I'm glad you asked that, because I think this was the thing that took a long time to take hold, is that I think for a lot of people, when they think alcoholic, they get in their mind probably a caricature of the severe end of the alcohol abuse spectrum, which is absolutely real. And there are people like my cousin suffering from that, where it's physically debilitating, causes extreme rupture and dysfunction in their working life and their family life, manifests in all sorts of physical diseases. I think people get that picture in their head and they say, well, that's not me. And so somebody like me, who I didn't even necessarily drink every day, although it was getting closer to that as things went along. But when I did drink, which was probably 4-5 nights out of the week, it was never a drink. I was never interested in a drink. I never had that off switch. It was always, a drink to me means minimally 6 drinks and probably more, closer to 10. And, I got to bed at a decent hour and I kept my life together. So to outward appearances, I didn't look like somebody who was losing it, but I was paying a really heavy toll. Probably physically. I hope I don't pay too dear consequences for all those years of drinking. But psychologically, the young term the kids use these days is hangxiety. And that is so corrosive, and was so corrosive over time, for day after day to be doing all the things that you need to get through the day as a human in the world, plus this additional level of regret, depression, anxiety that comes along with a hangover it was a really heavy toll. And I have to say, more than anything, the best feeling of the last year is not having hangovers.
Yeah. The tricky part, though, is what alcohol brought you in other ways. So the joyful times, the coming together for celebrations, drinking at weddings, drinking at Christmas parties. I'm just wondering, how you're grappling with that side of it, and how it's often so central at times when we come together.
Yeah, in the first episode of the show, I'm in conversation. I sort of put myself on the couch with a clinical psychologist named Catherine Fairbairn, who's at the University of Illinois, Champaign. And we were talking about that dimension of it. And I think she said that many of the clients that she works with describe it as breaking up with a romantic partner. And I think there's really something to that. Like I had been drinking since I was 14. And I'm not sure if it's a majority, but a huge number of Canadians have alcohol really built into their lives around those things that you're describing, around holidays, around big events. And honestly, I associate alcohol with some of the most joyful times of my life. And I wouldn't have drank the way I drank if I didn't love the stuff so much and love the feeling that it gave me. And I think you have to be upfront about that when you're having conversations about it. I think there's an impulse to maybe paint it as a manifestation of pure evil instead of acknowledge the rational reasons that people turn to it. And also, living in a really complicated, difficult world, and especially difficult time like the pandemic was, it offers real comfort. You pay a price for it, but at least fleetingly, you get a reprieve from things that are troubling you. And where it becomes, I think there are people who are able to get that reprieve in the form of a single drink. I wish I was one of those people, because that would be really nice, but it just never worked for me that way. I would have the single drink, and if I didn't have another one, I'd actually feel worse than I'd feel with no drink at all. And so that was the big acceptance, was, as Catherine put it, like realizing that this romantic partner in my life, alcohol, was no good for me, and that I had to step away and make a different choice.
I can only imagine the number of people who are listening right now, Jeff, who relate to what you're sharing. And so please don't hesitate to give us a call, 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. Dr. Peter Butt is with me here in studio. He's been nodding along to everything Jeff is saying. He's even been taking notes. So we'll get him to weigh in just a moment. And Jeff, I don't want you to go anywhere, because I just have a few more questions that I want to ask you. The number to call us today to talk about drinking, your own drinking, what you're seeing in society right now, the conversations we're having about the health effects, warning labels, all of that, 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. We got a note from Kevin who says, I just want to share that I worked for a company years ago that had a regular weekly gathering that was creatively called Beer Friday. Each Friday, as the name suggests, at the end of our shift, we would have a couple cases of beer in the lunchroom. Most who participated would have a single beer and then leave. But there was always a couple folks who went overboard and then drove themselves home. I'm thankful that the workplace culture that permitted this to happen eventually shifted. That comes to us from Kevin. Even thinking about dinner parties and the expectation that you show up with a bottle of wine. Jeff, you've been so gracious to share with us your personal journey with this, but I know you're a curious person, and so what questions have you been asking about the culture, the society that has kind of led many people to a similar place as you? Like, one thing that stands out from the podcast is you talking about Mad Men and how everybody was ordering old fashions. That was a particular moment in time that I think is very much still with many folks. But just what are your thoughts on society's relationship with alcohol and how that plays into this?
Well, I'm really glad that there's a conversation happening, and I know we're going to hear more about this, about labeling, because I think a lot of us think that we're somehow immune to messages and advertising, and that stuff doesn't have any effect. And the reason that came up in that conversation about Mad Men is it was such a realization to me when I reflected on it that absolutely worked on me. I'd never heard of an old fashioned in my life, and suddenly that became my go-to drink. Well, what more obvious example is that of the power of culture? And I don't think that was deliberate advertising. I'm not suggesting that the producers of Mad Men were in the bag for big alcohol, but it's amazing how effective that kind of message is. And so I think that if you get a contrary message, the unglamorous message of what the actual price of alcohol might be, maybe we'll think about it differently. But we also reflect in the series about how interesting it is that we treat it as though it's a category unto itself. It's always drugs and alcohol. We're talking about drugs and alcohol. Well, why are you breaking it off? I think people break it off because if you showed up to that same dinner party with a bag of crack cocaine, people might look at you askance. But I'm not going to absolutely make an equivalent between those things, but there's a similarity. People use drugs for reasons, and the reasons they use alcohol are not different than the reasons they use cocaine.
I think this is a good time to go back to Dr. Peter Butt. You've been listening, and just what are some of your initial thoughts as you hear Jeff share?
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. And you've brought out so many points that I think many listeners will relate to very, very well, because it's a common story of creep, of gradual increase in quantity and frequency. And fundamentally, people use substances to change the way we feel at a very basic level. And it might be simply to socialize. And we have often and historically and culturally used alcohol to mark transitions, whether it's the end of a work day, the end of a work week, a birth, a death, a marriage, and or some other celebratory event. So again, it's an alcoholic culture. We use it in these social situations in a celebratory manner. But unfortunately, what can happen is that it can gradually take over time. So it's often a process. It's not an event. However, when we think about how people start with alcohol, for a lot of people, their first drink was not pleasant. It tasted awful, unless it was masked with a whole lot of sweet juice and soda and that sort of thing. But for a lot of people, it was an acquired taste, and that was socially driven by the peers. And if you think back to adolescence, for many people, they gradually increased the amount because of peer pressure until they started having negative consequences. And then they thought, I should cut back on this. I'm running into some problems, and I don't like the way I feel. So that's how most people have learned to drink. And unfortunately, the social context is what really determines what the end point is. So in some situations, it might be at a very high level. And Mad Men is simply one case where it was in the culture of the workplace.
Yeah. Jeff, one last question for you just before we go. Are you noticing the shift? Just what are your thoughts on the moment that we're in right now?
I find it really hard to tell. My sense is that anecdotally is that the people around me sort of confirm what we were hearing earlier about a decline in drinking in younger people, which I'd like to think will eventually mean a decline in drinking among older people. But I have to say that it was actually among my age group at the dawn of I was 50 at the dawn of the pandemic, and I saw a big escalation in drinking among my social group. That I think people were giving themselves permission to I guess sort of self-medicate. I know I was. Since then, I've seen a big upswing in offerings, and I'm grateful for this, offerings of zero alcohol beer and mocktails, which I'm not generally crazy about, but I think at least having those options available for people, it signals something that it's not uncool to go out and not drink. So hopefully something's changing there.
Jeff, really good to have you on the show today. Thanks so much for making the time.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
That is Jeff Turner. He is the host of the CBC podcast on drugs. You know where to find CBC podcasts: Apple, Spotify, CBC Listen, whatever your favorite podcast app is. I'm Leisha Gravinsky. You are listening to Blue Sky. We'd love for you to call today, 1-800-716-2221, or email bluesky@cbc.ca. And you may have strong thoughts about this next conversation that we're going to have, because I think the question that a lot of people are posing is alcohol the new tobacco? Some people think alcohol should come with warning labels the same way tobacco products do. Dr. Kara Thompson is research chair in substance use policy and prevention in the Department of Psychology at St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia, and she's been looking at the role alcohol labels could play. She's on the line right now. Dr. Thompson, welcome.
Thank you.
Good to have you. So, what conversations are currently happening around alcohol labeling?
I think we're hearing alcohol labels come up a lot lately, and I think that's good news that the conversation is open. People are feeling more supportive of the idea of labels. And the U.S. Surgeon General advisory that just came out also recommended them. Our new guidance in alcohol and health recommended them. And I think there's a demand from consumers to be more aware of the harms to them from consuming particular products. And so it makes sense that they want information, right? That they want to be informed. When you're buying a product, you want to be informed about the possible risks of it. And for a long time, alcohol has been exempt from needing to warn consumers about the harms of consuming the product. And it's time for that to end.
What would happen, though, if we did have those labels? So obviously smoking habits have changed, right? The rates have decreased. So when you talk to people in the alcohol industry, because you're doing some work with a brewery about how warning labels could change or how that will impact consumption habits. So tell me about that, because that's a really interesting angle on this.
Yeah, so a lot of the research on warning labels has been done kind of in online or like laboratory experiments, not in real world settings where people are actually exposed to labels and we're able to look at them. And we also are in a situation where, public health is pushing for labels and the industry is pushing back against labels. And so this project is kind of unique in that we're working with local breweries, which are more grassroots than kind of big alcohol. And they have popped up in small communities across the country. And these guys aren't the first to be willing to put some sort of health label on their container, but we are working collaboratively with them. They've volunteered to put our evidence-based warning label on their product, and come summertime here. And we're going to look at how that label may actually impact consumers' knowledge about the harms from alcohol, about Canada's new guidance on alcohol and health, and whether it impacts their alcohol consumption.
Why do you think the brewery wanted to do this?
Yeah, when I spoke to the brewery, they aren't big alcohol. They really are committed to values that are more aligned with their consumers. So breweries have really built brands around things like sustainability and shopping local. And I think telling consumers about the health risks of consumption align with their values, more so than perhaps big alcohol. They're not expecting, and I think it comes down to people being like, well, is it going to take business away from them? It could in the long run, but in the likelihood in the short term, they're probably going to get some accolades for stepping up, being socially responsible, and putting some labels on their products. They're not really concerned about losing business.
But that's interesting to me, because what is the point of the warning? To give people information, but the ultimate goal would be to have them decrease consumption.
Yeah, that kind of comes back to the psychology of behavior change, right? Behavior change, knowledge doesn't necessarily translate into behavior change. Just because we know something's bad for us doesn't necessarily mean that we always don't refrain from doing it. That applies to things, not just alcohol. So in some instances, having that knowledge will change our behavior in some capacity, but it doesn't necessarily translate into behavior change. Now, there's certainly some evidence that warning labels can have an impact on behavior change. But beyond whether or not they work, it's kind of a basic consumer right to have the information that the product can cause harm, right? We know that every processed food in Canada now has a label that warns us about the sodium, the trans fats, and the sugars. Cannabis and tobacco both have warning labels, and alcohol seems to be exempt despite it costing more to us in society in terms of healthcare costs than any other substance.
What exactly would be on the label? And I don't know, I guess that's a live conversation. And again, I'm thinking of tobacco labels and how graphic they became. What would you like to see on alcohol?
Yeah, so I think that's the concern of industry, is that we'll model our labels after tobacco. And there are many countries in the world that have different versions of warning labels. There's not really kind of a standardization, but what we are putting on our label is a cancer warning. Okay, so alcohol can cause cancer. We're also putting Canada's new guidance in alcohol and health, so some information about that continuum of risk, what's considered low risk or high risk. And we'll have a standard drink label, so that will tell consumers how many drinks are in the beverage product. So we're combining those three pieces of information. And there's some research that suggests these kind of multi-component labels are much better than single component labels.
Dr. Butt, what are your thoughts on this? I know you've referenced labels, but I'm assuming this is in line with your thinking too, but do you want to just chime in there?
Oh, absolutely. And thanks for that information, Karen. And good to hear you and see you on the monitor. But what she's described are the three different categories for labeling. And people can't manage what they can't measure. So the standard drink labeling is very important, because the beverages aren't necessarily any longer determined by a standard drink. And indeed, if we get into something like wine, which is could be 12% alcohol, it could be 14% alcohol, the number of standard drinks in a 750 ml bottle can vary from 5 to 6 or, So how does the consumer know? How do they know how much they're drinking? So the standard drink labeling is important. The health impacts, I think, are very important. This is really quite basic, and it's absolutely a consumer right to know. And if we think of what happens with the packaging for furniture, for instance, we're cautioned not to put the plastic bag over our head. Mm-hmm. It seems rather ridiculous. But here we have a Group 1 carcinogen intended to be ingested with absolutely no warning label whatsoever. And this is important to people because they may not know, or they may actually have had experience with cancer, or they might have a family history of cancer, such as breast cancer or liver, whatever the case may be. So this is important information for consumers in order for them to make an informed decision. And then, of course, the third category is some guidance around it. Well, what are the health risks associated with the amount that we drink? And it increases with the amount that we consume.
I'd really like to hear from people today. Your thoughts on this. Are labels necessary? How would you react if you were at a liquor store and saw that? Give us a call today, 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. We are asking you a few things. So we would like reaction to labeling, but also you heard a really strong personal story from a CBC colleague, Jeff Turner, who's the host of On Drugs, and this season takes takes a really personal look at his own alcohol consumption. So if you want to share with us how you're navigating your own drinking, if you're trying to reduce or just where you're at with that, 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. I do want to say we did get a call from addictions counselor Rand Teed, who wants more education in general to help people understand if they have a problem. Dr. Butt, more education, how important is that?
Oh, absolutely. And just as people have a right to know with regards to the health impacts of alcohol more broadly, I think it's important for them to realize when they're getting into trouble. And I mentioned some of the core things, such as loss of control. And they may have no problem whatsoever when they're not drinking alcohol, but it's when they do that you can drill into the relationship. Do they lose control? Does it start, and Jeff described this very, very well, does it start with just one, or is that never enough? And they need to have more and more and then more because of withdrawal and tolerance that builds up. The other is, in addition to the loss of control, is that continued use despite negative consequences. So these may be relational, these may be workplace, this may be a physical altercation or something like that in terms of the negative consequences. But if they continue to push on it and not step back from this relationship when it becomes problematic, that's another issue. And again, that compulsivity where people may not want to drink necessarily. They may want to cut down, but in combination with the loss of control, they feel compelled to use it. And they're using it at a level that once they start, they don't intend to. So these are different factors. And when we think about the different domains, it's really about impaired control. How are they scoring with regards to that? What about the physical dependency and some of that tolerance and withdrawal that they're beginning to see? Social problems is another category, and this could be within relationships, within the family, within the workplace, and challenges to perform or meet the normal responsibilities on a day-to-day basis.
But
and then there's risky use as well, like driving and drinking.
For sure, yes. Even though if it's not escalating to that point, the message is less is better for you. So
absolutely.
Can I ask you a personal question?
Sure.
Do you drink?
No, I don't. I choose not to. And there's a host of reasons, family reasons, extended family reasons, cultural, spiritual reasons. I know too much about the industry. It's not one that I choose to support. So it becomes political, it's social, it's immensely personal. So this is something that we need to respect people's choice and decision on. So I think conversations like this are really, really important to stimulate reflection on that relationship. Because if it's become a dysfunctional relationship, we can change it.
So here's another question for you, though. Are you hearing about more people replacing alcohol with another drug? So maybe saying no to alcohol, but instead choosing cannabis. It's easy to get these days. There's so many stores. I'm told it's cheaper. Is that happening?
Well, I think it might be happening with some individuals. Across the board, I think we need perhaps a little bit more data on that. But when you're changing out one psychoactive drug because you have developed some problems with it, alcohol specifically, and you're introducing another psychoactive drug thinking that you're going to get a free ride, you may be looking at just shifting the chairs on the Titanic. Because people who use cannabis on a daily basis are the ones that are going to run into significant problems with it. Very occasional use, low levels of THC may not be nearly as problematic as that daily use that people are getting into with high levels of THC concentration. So again, there are low-risk cannabis use guidelines, but one of the problems we have with cannabis is the lack of definition of a standard dose. So, how do you know when you're going to get into problems? If you can't measure something, you can't really manage it effectively. And if the people around you are the barometer that you're using as to whether or not it's okay, then maybe you should be looking at how well they're doing.
Dr. Kara Thompson, I want to Is it okay to ask you a personal question?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Do you drink? Do you drink?
I do. Yes, I do drink alcohol. Yeah.
And-
In moderation. I did dry January along with all the others, but yes, I do enjoy a glass of wine. And that's a decision I make knowing my risk. And it's about taking, I think, calculated risks, which we do every day in our life, right? Like when we get on airplanes, when we get in our vehicle every day, when we eat processed food, we are assuming some amount of risk. And I want to kind of go back to you talking about, the education piece, because I think it's really easy for people to discount the risk, right? And say, that's not going to be me. Right. So-and-so might get cancer from their alcohol use, but that won't be me. And understanding risk is really hard for people. But there is a new tool that was just released by the Canadian Institute for Substance Use Research. And it's a website called knowalcohol.ca, which is KNOW. And it actually lets you go in and put in your alcohol consumption and your age and your sex, and it'll tell you what your personalized risk of a variety of health outcomes are. From your current consumption, and also lets you put in, like, let's say I drink 10 drinks a week and now I only want to drink 5. How will my risk change? And it'll tell you what you'll gain back or how you'll reduce your risk from changing your use. And so that kind of what we call personalized feedback is much more impactful than like general education.
But I just want to ask you a bit more about that. Is that asking any other kind of health history? Like, are you able to input that a relative had breast cancer? Because those factors contribute to all of this too, and that's where it gets confusing
100%.
For people. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's not sophisticated enough to include those types of things yet. Because they do matter. There is a genetic predisposition to a variety of these health conditions that it doesn't account for. So it's not going to be a perfect estimate, but all things considered, everything else considered equal, it does give you at least some idea of the types of things you might be at risk for and how great that risk is at your current levels of consumption if you stay at that level.
Dr. Thompson, I want to ask you the question that I put to Dr. Butt kind of at the start of the show. And like, you are the first person on the program today to say that you do drink. And so I'm curious about how you have these kinds of conversations without coming across as judgy. And you want to give people information. You want people to make the best choices for themselves. But I know when the guidelines first came out, like, there was a lot of pushback and just some early reluctance. So how what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, no one wants to be told that the thing that they're enjoying doing is bad for them. Like, no one wants to be told that. And so our immediate response is to have a defensive response. Like, that can't be true. Where's the actual evidence? And, as a member of that committee that came up with these guidelines, figuring out how to communicate this guidance to consumers without telling them what to do and that they should never have more than 2 drinks per occasion was a conversation we had spent a lot of time on, because how you deliver messages matters. So it's not surprising to me that people had that reaction. But I hope what they take from those guidance is that less is better and that you should get informed so that you can make decisions that are right for you. And I am not, I really come at my work from a harm reduction lens and not an abstinence-based lens, and largely because I work with young people and they don't respond well to abstinence-based messages. And so the fact that I do drink, but I also am aware of the consequences, I think sometimes helps people better understand that there are different decisions you can make with your alcohol. You can abstain completely. You can use a little bit. You can just use a little bit less than you already are using. And that your consumption might change from month to month or year to year across your life course.
Interesting. I just want to end with asking you each about policy changes that you would like to see, the role policy could play in this. Dr. Thompson, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so for policy, for sure, I want to see mandatory warning labels, and I'd like to see them to be consistent across provinces and across industry. I don't want to see them vary from product to product. The other thing, though, that we haven't talked about that much today, although Jeff did kind of mention it, was advertising. I think we should be having much stronger restrictions on advertising. Advertising is incredibly powerful. It's pervasive in our society. It's what keeps alcohol part of our culture. And young people in particular are highly exposed to advertising. And we have almost no regulations on it. The regulations haven't been updated since 1996. They don't apply to social media. There's no complaint system that even if you see one that you don't think should be there, you can't complain about it. So we should be banning alcohol advertising, or at least severely restricting it. And that would be what I'd like to see. Yeah.
Dr. Butt, what about you?
Well, there's a host of policy interventions, and there's the Canadian Alcohol Policy Evaluation Study that people can look up. And these are all policies that have been enacted in one jurisdiction or another, but no one jurisdiction has enacted all of those policies at once. So across the country, every jurisdiction ended up with a failing grade. And this has to do with pricing, taxation, availability, labeling, cost, all of these things. So this is where I think that we definitely have seen problems post-pandemic with increased availability. We don't need 24-hour-a-day access to alcohol on our doorstep. There's no need for this, and it creates public health problems. So I think availability is something that we need to rethink, even though a lot of places are making it more available in convenience stores and that sort of thing. I think there are going to be problems with that subsequently. Similarly with cost, and one of the things that Saskatchewan did do well in the past was there was a time when it increased taxation on it, and it resulted in a decreased level of consumption, but revenues increased overall. So this was a win-win. From a public health point of view, there was decreased consumption, so there would have been decreased harms. From a government revenue point of view, even with decreased consumption, there was increased revenue.
Interesting. Okay, well, you've given me lots to think about. We have to end it there. Dr. Butt, thank you as always.
My pleasure.
And Dr. Kara Thompson, thanks for being with us today. It was great to meet you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Kara Thompson is Research Chair in Substance Use Policy and Prevention in the Department of Psychology at St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia. And Dr. Peter Butt, a voice we know well here, does many things. He is an clinical associate professor in the College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. He also co-chaired Canada's Guide on Alcohol and Health.